Hello everyone. This is the second video on feminism. In the last video, I gave you a sort of an introduction to feminism. From this video onwards, we will be tracing the history of feminist movement. We all know that we are sitting in the wake of 21st century, acquiring all sorts of rights because of movements like feminism. So it's in this particular time, it's necessary for each and every one of us to remember our roots before we even think of placing ourselves in a position where we could declare ourselves as not being a feminist. Though with post-feminism, of course, we'll be talking about post-feminism in some other video. We have a sort of a backlash, as Susan Faludi would call it, a kind of a reverse movement, a kind of a counter-assault on feminism, a kind of a celebration of domesticity, domestic nirvana, as they would call it. We should, of course, have in mind our roots. It's because of the struggles and sacrifices of those people, those negatively labeled feminists, that we could boldly declare ourselves as not being a feminist. For me, a feminist is anybody who understands that there is a cultural categorization on the basis of gender, and a person who works ideologically and practically to bring about a sort of an acceptance and accommodation of multiplicity of genders and celebrates the differences amongst them. It is, of course, a blurring of the binaries, tracing our past, bringing to the forefront any discussion, bringing to the forefront any discussion about the past is something that everyone is bound to do. In this video, I will try to trace the past which we should, of course, remember before we dare to proclaim in loud voices that I'm not a feminist. So usually when we talk of feminist theory as such, we have a tendency to begin with first wave feminism. Before this first wave feminism, did we have women who did voice for themselves? Let's check that out. We all know that feminist movements had its beginning in a very practical level, almost in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Way before that, we did have women who spoke for themselves, at first confining themselves to the religious and cultural restrictions imposed on them, and later on breaking those religious chains and coming out to speak for themselves from a purely secular platform. First of all, let's begin with the religious roots of feminism. For centuries in Europe, unmarriageable and unnecessary daughters were shut in convents. See, while you are imprisoned, you have two options. One, you can take this imprisonment physically as well as mentally and get chained and think about the doomed destiny that you have. On the other hand, you can also take it as Anton Chekhov describes in the story The Bet. You could take it as a platform for genuine fulfillment, to reflect upon yourself, to read things, to think about things, a kind of a genuine fulfillment of your talents, to discover your own distinctive voices. That is another option of confinement, imprisonment. So you have lots of unmarriageable daughters, unnecessary daughters who were shut in their convents, who took this as a sort of a chance so that they could develop themselves. They read a lot, they thought a lot, they wrought a lot, they developed their talents everywhere, as musicians, as composers, as writers, as great readers, people who thought. They have transformed their confinement into a sort of a liberation. See, Hildegard of Bingen of 11th century, she turns out to be, she was a nun, and she turns out to be a very impressive writer, a very impressive composer, where she is discovering her own talents in writing. Later on, she was known and honored all over Europe. She traveled all over Europe. She wrote a lot about, of course, because you had this religious restrictions and all. She wrote a lot about motherhood, about maternal experiences, about women, etc., etc. And but the problem with this was that, maybe because of the religious constrictions at that time, all these acts, reading, writing, composing, etc., thinking, of course, thinking, were considered unfeminine activities. So what happened was that even Hildegard of Bingen had this doubt of her unfeminine side. Whatever she did, sometimes she did have doubt that whatever she was doing, was it unfeminine or not. So because women who composed, women who wrote, women who read, women who thought, women who preached, she was a person who had gone all over Europe and preached there. So preached all over Europe. So women who preach, all were considered unfeminine at that time. So we had our first mother there in Hildegard of Bingen, who did speak out for them herself, speak out about motherhood, about maternal experiences, about women, though she was very much confined inside the religious restrictions imposed on women at that time. Then you have Julian of Norwich. We will come to the 15th century. She was a woman, of course, she was also a woman, a nun, because and she did celebrate motherhood. She talked about maternal experiences, etc. And she says, I'll just quote it: "Just because I'm a woman, must I therefore believe that I must not tell you about the goodness of God?" See, in a world order where women are prohibited to speak even about God, this was a purely a kind of a very bold voice from a nun, from Julian of Norwich. See, Julian of Norwich was talking more about motherhood and maternal experiences, and she herself was not a mother. So being celibate and celebrating motherhood is one thing, and becoming a mother and understanding all the problems, all the problems connected with motherhood and talking about motherhood is another thing. So you have there Margaret Cavendish, who was the other way around. She was not a nun. So Cavendish was a contemporary of Julian, and she suffered through 14 pregnancies, and at last she had to come up with a negotiation with her husband, and she left him and traveled all across Europe. She was a person who did not celebrate motherhood at all, because she was a person who had gone through 14 pregnancies. That too, she had kind of troublesome pregnancies, so she couldn't actually celebrate motherhood as such. By the 16th century, women began to speak in loud voices, began to voice themselves in a more aggressive manner, but within the religious framework. Women did try to break religious clutches in one way or the other. You have an example of Jane Anger. Jane Anger, as her name itself suggests, she was very angry at the patriarchy inside the religious discourse. She took up the position that Eve was superior to Adam. Eve was the second model, and hence an improved model. Whereas Adam was made of dross and filthy clay, God made Eve from Adam's flesh so that she be purer than he. Anger was also a person who talked much about domestic life of women, and says that it is, I quote, "It is women who make sure that men are fed, men are clothed, and men are cleaned, and without the care of women, they lie in their beds as dogs in litter, and go like lousy mackerel swimming in the heat of summer." See, you have women using disgusting images, angry images, even when it was done inside the religious discourse. See, there were lots and lots of negative images about women represented in scriptures, which women had to tackle. The first being Eve, responsible for man's fall. Church deliberately hushed, deliberately silenced women's voices. The church's attitude towards women's voices is, I quote, let your women keep silence in churches, for it's not permitted for them to speak. If they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. It is a shame, for it is a shame for women to speak inside the church. And it was with Jane anger that women began to enter the debate, enter the discourse about themselves in their own voices. Later on, we have reinterpretations of Genesis through many writers like Amelia, Margaret Fox, Sarah Egerton, etc. And women writers began to bring about models even from scripture, strong women characters from Bible, from classical mythology, from Greek and Roman history, from European history, etc. Like you have Queen Elizabeth becoming cited as an example. During the Civil War, because of the emergence of lots and lots of religious sects like Quakers, like Baptists, Browners, etc., women slowly, gradually began to enter not public life as such, but slowly towards the public life. Christina de Pizan is described as the first Western woman to live by her pen. She was, of course, educated by her father and she began writing right after her husband's death. She criticizes the literature by men, which where you have the spread of wicked insults about women and their behavior. She says that be it a man or be it a woman, in whom resides greater virtue is higher. Loftiness and lowliness of a person does not lie in the body but in virtue and conduct. This is what Christina de Pizan says. She was a French writer. Every woman who spoke out at that time were doing it, confining themselves to the religion or serving the purpose of religion. It was one thing to be unfeminine when you're talking about religion. When you're so very divinely inspired, it was okay to be unfeminine. But then, speaking unconventionally, speaking in the so-called unfeminine way, out of personal interest or out of pure ambition was something that the world order at that time couldn't accept. Of course, we have a model in Queen Elizabeth who was very much learned, very much read. She was the Queen of England. She was very fluent in Latin, Greek and French. See, the private life of this queen was of a versifier. Roger Ascham, her tutor, said that her mind had no womanly weakness and her perseverance is equal to that of a man. But though she excelled much, she was the Queen of England, she was bold enough, courageous enough, she did get all the chances to speak, she could get enough education, she was not at all supportive towards other women. Her attitude was also very negative. She herself says, in her own words, she is proclaiming that women are very weak and frail. She herself says, I'll just quote it, I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and that too a king of England. But then what we should understand from this is that though she was not supportive of women at that time, even sometimes what happens is the presence of a strong-willed woman is in itself motivating, and maybe she was able to influence other women to pursue unfeminine ambitions as such. Batsua Makin, who was the governess of the daughter of one of the daughters of Charles I, wrote about the importance of women receiving solid education. She was a person who was a governess who ran a school of her own, and she wanted women to get educated. She says, I quote, Let women be fools and you will make them slaves. Of course, it was later that she ran a school for women. But then she too did not want to hinder women from good wifery, good housewifery. That is what they call it, good housewifery. She said that I have never called women from their necessary labor to studies. Her intention was just to equalize women to men, and but as far as education was concerned, and she asserted the point that women are of course the weaker sex. Then you have another woman, Margaret Cavendish. She was the Duchess of Newcastle. She was the first female intellectual to write poems on particle physics, about atoms, and she wrote much of philosophical verse. She was a person who was very much torn between the feminine and Christian virtue of modesty and her own ambitions on the other side. She was a person who had to bear with lots and lots of criticisms because of her writings, because readers were so very unkind, especially male readers as well as female readers were very much unkind to a woman writing, to a woman becoming a writer. See, the problem with the patriarchal convention is that patriarchal conventions have confined women so much that even one woman feels jealous of another woman writing. So at that time, even women who did read, women who belonged to the upper middle class family, they called Margaret Cavendish a mad, a ridiculous woman. And she had always tried to inspire women, though she met with she had to meet with lots and lots of criticisms. She was a person who tried to inspire women through her writing. Anne Bradstreet was another writer who of course belonged to a rich family, so she had access to books, had access to education. She did have a huge library, and she was quite attracted to metaphysical poetry, and she was a great poet as well. Then you have a very important writer, Aphra Behn. She was the first loud, clear and wholly independent voice in literature who could survive all the jeering criticisms leveled against her and could hold with any male writer at that time. She was a person who had suffered lots and lots of problems in her personal life as well, and her writings are also quite influential, quite interesting in the sense she did write lots of plays, lots of poetry, and sometimes we feel like her life is more interesting than her works, or is as interesting as her works. She wrote about female independence, she wrote about forced marriage, she wrote about slavery, racism, gender, etc., etc., etc. And another most important thing is that she was the first woman writer to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Now, towards the end of this video, I'm going to introduce you a person who is actually one of the earliest true feminists, or perhaps the first writer to explore and assert ideas about women which we could still relate to. It's none other than Mary Astill, who is very radical in her perception towards women's lives. Maybe in her own personal life she is somewhat conventional, but then when we take her attitude towards women, her perceptions are quite her views are quite radical. She was all the time stressing the need for women to get educated. She has written some works, and in one of her work, which is titled A Serious Proposal to Ladies, which was published in 1694, she says that girls should be taught to think for themselves, to judge clearly and sensibly, than to acquire the so-called graceful social skills and accomplishments. In some other work, which is titled Some Reflections About Marriage, which was published in the year 1700, she asked, what else do we teach poor women than to get a husband? Do we actually teach them to have some sort of a higher design in their life, higher purpose in their life? Even now we have that kind of a concept. Even now we are not shaken off, or we are not able to get rid of that kind of a mentality that marriage becomes the be all and end all of a woman's life, a girl's life. What else do we teach them? What else do we teach women, girls, to have a higher design than to get a husband? Mary Astill was also a person who was behind sketching an ideal community, a kind of a convent where women could relate to, women could retire from the so-called horrible reality that they are in. They could retire to that kind of a cozy world, an idyllic world, a kind of a paradise where Adam would never have a place there, where women would be providing mutual support. You have Aphra Bain, Catherine Phillips, Anne Finch, etc. later on taking up subjects related to female friendships and writing passionately about relationships with other women. Mary Astill created a sort of a religious retreat where they could spiritually and intellectually be nourished. And it was Cavendish who transformed this religious retreat into a secular one, where a man in a woman's dress could enter, in the sense that a man who is ready to appreciate his feminine side could enter this secular retreat. Her contribution, Mary Astill's contribution to feminism is really very important, in the sense that she was the person who urged women to take themselves seriously, to trust in their own judgments, and to make choices, to develop their talents, to educate themselves, not to think of marriage alone in life, to have higher designs in life. She brought about lots of publications exclusively for women. We talked about lots and lots of women who did voice themselves, though they were doing it within religious and trying to break the religious constraints that were around them. But these were some sporadic voices. They could not form a unified group and all. These sporadic voices could never end the legal and constitutional position of women. And it was with first wave feminism that we have women taking up individual issues of individual persons were taken up, and solutions were brought up, as a result of which you have legal and constitutional changes being made, which did accommodate women's rights as well. We'll talk about that in the coming videos. Thank you all.